Okay, here I go. Here's my video. I know I keep putting it off because I keep getting distracted by these stupid uploads of, oh, the press secretary is uploading a video or doing a press conference, so I'll click on that and watch it, and then it'll be a bunch of horse crap of them telling everything's fine, right? So I end up watching that, and then I get distracted because it's all this crap happening, right? And all these meetings they had this morning with the House committee about immigration and stuff. And of course, nothing happens naturally, and they're trying to pass these bills for immigration and saying, "Oh, we're going to shut the government down if we don't get immigration under control." And then the other side is saying, "Oh, we have to get more funding to help integrate these people into these communities and get them housing and stuff." And it's like we lose either way. All this stuff, we're losing. It's all evil, and we're losing. So, anyways, and if I want to get my Rumble channel to work, I have to have at least 1,000 subscribers. So that's going to be, I would say, a pretty tough undertaking because uh, I only have 250 or 249 on this platform. So to actually reach 1,000 on Rumble could probably take years. So I probably won't be able to live stream on there for years. If our country even lasts that long, I guess, to even allow me to do it. Because by the time I get the privilege of doing it, our country could be completely crumbled. So what really matter about free speech platforms? Because by then free speech will be pretty much null and void, and the Rumble platform will probably help uphold that rule and make it into a ghost town, basically. The Rumble and all the other sites will be ghost towns because they won't be allowed to have any free speech on them. So that'll happen if who's reelected. So, and it will happen because it's obvious, pretty fucking obvious. Sorry about my language, but it'll be very obvious what's going to happen. Oh yeah, then there's the that one channel I used to watch. I mean, I watch it periodically, but not as often. It's called the United Spot, and yeah, they do make videos based on the current things that just happened, but they put like a funny on it to make it funny. But I think what's happening is that people don't find it funny anymore. People that are conservative don't find it as funny as it was because we're not winning. We're not winning anything. We're not making any strides. We're not gaining anything. So we keep losing and more crumbling is happening. So people aren't willing, or people aren't as able. What am I saying? People aren't as likely to want to watch a parody of what just happened and making fun of it and laughing, because it's not funny because our country is crumbling and turning into a shithole, and it smells like cockroaches and piss and all this other stuff. It smells like corruption. It smells like a bad neighborhood, and it's everywhere. Like a really stale cigarette ashtray, mixed in with dirt and filth and roaches and bed bugs and all that. And then you have to clean that up. That's what it feels like. That's what it seems like. It's like the Democrat Party is like a dirty ashtray mixed in with roaches and shit and piss and all that. And they're trying to spread that all over the place, Like when you have sketchy neighbors that are hella dirty, and that's the smell you get from it. That's the filth, where there's like a layer of black soot mixed in with sticky crap and bird turds and everything else, right? It's like a dirty bottom of a dirty bird cage, a bird that's been neglected, and that's what they want us to live in, that kind of degraded filth. That's when you have to dust off these old books right here to understand what's really happening and what's going to go on. And they're lying to us and saying, oh, inflation is gone, it's going away and all that. It's like, no, it's not going away, because what's going to happen is once they're reelected back in, these commies, they're really going to let us have it. They're going to cut down all these social platforms where we can't communicate with each other. They're already doing it with the phone service, where they're not going to allow people to send certain texts, or the texts are going to be monitored. And it's just one phone company doing it right now, but the rest of them are going to start doing it too. They're going to start monitoring people, their texts, and then send warnings over to, who's to give out information to them that's private. Normally your text should be private, but they're not. They're not going to be. Once Potato gets back in the second term, your text messages aren't going to be private. They're going to be public information, as in, who agencies will have access to that information, which would normally be protected information that would not be disclosed. Uh, Normally, you wouldn't want people reading all your text messages and all your emails. That's very private. It's like notes that you're getting from other people. You don't want people reading your personal notes or your personal information based on things that you do on a daily basis. You wouldn't want somebody reading that. But they're going to make that to where they can access that, and they're going to make everything digital, where everyone will have to be on the digital system in order to communicate or have anything. And there probably won't be really any homeless people, because homeless people are pretty much anonymous. I mean, they do have cell phones and all that, but other than that, they're not on the digital system for the most part. So they're going to end that and make everybody slaves. You know what I mean? We're all going to be slaves to them. Sucks. Duh. But I just see the lies are just pouring off these people. It's just sickening. Absolutely sickening. Telling us everything is fine. It's not. I was going to read part of this book, a piece of it. See, this is the beginning of this book. I don't want to read the foreword on it, because it just explains why the author wrote this book and what it means, and it's kind of like a summary, I guess, of the whole book, even though it's a really thick see this living room in the background? That's a beautiful living room, isn't it? But can you imagine if corruption got in there? Basically communist. This room would be full of filth and fentanyl and flicked ash and roaches and bugs, stuff like that. And the roof would be caving in because nobody knows how to fix it. The chimney would be full of soot because nobody knows how to clean it. And they wouldn't allow firewood, so you wouldn't be able to use it to heat your house, because it would be illegal to use fireplace. Like in the Bay Area in California, they're not allowed to use their wood stove, or not wood stove, but their fireplace certain days of the week. They can only use it on certain days only. I remember when I lived down there, that was a rule, because I knew someone that had a fireplace inside their house. And they said they were only allowed to use it on certain days, and all they would use is like a decorative, stupid Duralog or whatever it's called, Duraflame log, which doesn't do much. It doesn't heat the house up or do shit. So they're just going to make you have to use electric to heat your house, all the central heat and air, right? It's all run on electricity. And that's what they want. They don't want people using firewood to heat their house or cook by or whatever, because people used to cook by fire, cook by, or stay warm with the wood stove, and then they would cook on it too. That's why the cast iron came in, because cast iron is fireproof. Basically, you could throw it in a fire and it will never melt. It can probably stand like 1,000 degrees and it won't burn. It won't melt. And people use it to cure it too. They cure the cast iron by putting it in fire, basically. And also, it does rust, but you can always scrape the rust off. You know what I mean? And scour it out, and then put oil in the bottom to cure it, to make it not. It's not like Teflon where it doesn't stick. Things will still stick to it, of course, but the iron in it is good for you. It's good for your system. That's why they want to get rid of fireplaces on that, because they don't want people cooking by fire or staying warm by fire to try to stay alive. You know what I mean? They don't want you doing that. They want everybody using artificial heat, which is electric for the most part. I think they're trying to get rid of the gas or whatever to heat by or cook by. So people don't have the option, because when the power goes out, the gas still works. You can still turn on your gas stove, and you can still cook. by gas, which is a blessing, I guess. If you need to heat up water or something, it's cold, So, and that's why they want to get rid of that and then get rid of the fireplaces and wood stoves. They banned the installation of wood stoves in homes. Of like a few years ago, I guess they said no more. You can't put wood stoves in anymore. And wood stoves are awesome because the metal in the wood stove heats up and it warms the room up just by the metal being heated up. And you could put a kettle on there and heat water up. Remember those old stoves? They were like they actually cooked things with fire. People would put wood in there and then they could cook on the stove top with fire and then cook inside the oven. That's why they used to call them brick ovens and stuff. Anyways, blah, blah, blah. So, anyways, trying to think of all the stuff I've tried to think of. It's hard to do that. Maybe I should change the background because it's not realistic. This one's funny. I made this myself. I designed it on my computer. On the artsy fartsy part of it, where you could make creations. It's like Google Editor or whatever. So I was able to make this. I don't know why it's. Anyways, that's what I made that. I just add that little creature in there with the potato. So okay, I'm going to thumb through this real quick. There's so much information in this book. You learn a lot. This is okay. This is the beginning of the book before the Depression actually hit, and then it hits. This is Henry Ford. Wow. Yeah, this is before the Depression hit. Okay, this is the beginning of the book. It says called The Hungry Years, right? Literally The Hungry Years. At 4 o'clock in the morning on January 2nd, 1929, a mass of men began to form in the enormous car park across Miller Road from gate number 3 of the Ford Motor Company's plant on the banks of the River Rogue near Dearborn, Michigan. The sky was overcast and the pre-dawn night was black, that the men were given a faintly sinister presence by the eerie glow from the interior factory lights filtered through the blue-tinted windows in the pulsing foundry and blast furnace fires of the largest industrial complex in the world. 90 individual buildings totaling 229 acres of floor space scattered over 2,000 acres. 2 of the buildings exceeded 1,500 feet in length, the equivalent of 5 football fields, each one seemingly made entirely of windows. River Rogue also had its own deep water port to accommodate ships from the Great Lakes laden with coal and iron ore, and its own railroad system, with 93 miles of track to shuttle supplies and products to and from railheads in and around Detroit. There were 27 miles of there were 27 miles of conveyors. Each kind of conveyor, known to industrial engineering, many of which stretch from building to building like covered bridges, linking operations in an angular web of clattering productivity. In this complex alone, more than 40,000 employees manufactured the parts for and assembled Model A Fords and Fords and tractors and Ford Trimotor airplanes. It took 5,000 maintenance workers just to clean the place. The nearest thing to the sublime in Michigan, Leonard Lance and Klein had written the nearest thing to the sublime in Michigan, Leonard Lance and Klein had written in The Nation back in November 1922, is the Ford factory. See it at dusk some October afternoon. From a distance away, a vast, squat, looming monster, glinting a shrill blue light from its windows into the shadows, gibbering, ominous. Out of the tall chimneys drifts black smoke. It smuts one's nose and collar, and the soot of it cakes over one's imagination. It is too heavy for wings. Klein could have written such a description again this January morning, a little over 6 years later, but it was 14 degrees below zero out in the car park now, and the men pulling up their collars, clutching their coats closed at the neck, jamming their free hands into their pockets, trying not to inhale the gelid air too deeply, stamping in several inches of rigid, crackling snow to keep their feet from freezing. These men probably were not worrying about soot in their noses or in their collars, few of which were clean to begin with. As dawn began to reveal the stark geometry of buildings that rose like prison blocks in the thin light, what they were worrying about was whether they would soon become one of the chosen, a Ford employee. There were an estimated 32,000 job seekers crammed into the car park, waiting to be hired. Having responded to an invitation broadcast by the company at the year's end, the men ranged the demographic spectrum from white, native Anglo-Saxons out of Tennessee to first-generation Polish immigrants out of Pittsburgh, from African-American cotton pickers who had escaped the Mississippi Delta to Mexican-American beet field workers who had crossed into the United States, legally and otherwise, at the Rio Grande. That's where they're having the problems right now, is the Rio Grande. There's people drowning in the Rio Grande. They're coming in illegally. Ford's employment division had promised that local men from Detroit, Dearborn, and other nearby cities would be given preference, but the sheer numbers involved made such fine distinctions impossible. We are from other states. One of the men admitted to a reporter for the New York Republic. Yeah, we used to be a republic. Now we're a democracy, right? But if we asked about it, we've been in Detroit all our lives. What we want is a job. What they got was a grim human lottery. Burly hiring agents stood at the plant's gate, letting in the first 10 men, dismissing the following 10, letting in the next 10, and so on. A bleak assembly line process that continued hour after hour, when fights broke out among men jostling for position at the front of the mass. Ford security guards turned fire hoses on them. Drenched and miserable, men collapsed from exhaustion, exposure, and hypothermia. Some were taken to local hospitals, though a few with a little change in their pockets staggered into a nearby 10-cent movie house to thaw out. Most remained where they stood, hoping to become one of the 30,000 new employees the company said it would need over the next several weeks to bring its total workforce to more than 150,000 and raise production by 20% to meet demand. The company was accustomed to dealing in such outsized numbers. A little over a year and a half before, the last Model T Ford had rattled off the production line, and the company had shut down completely for several months to develop the Model A. Some 60,000 workers in the Detroit area alone were let go, with thousands more laid off in parts and assembly plants around the country. Henry Ford, founder of both Henry Ford, founder of both the Feast and then the Sudden Famine, thought the layoffs would be psychologically beneficial for his workers. I know it's done them a lot of good, he told a reporter from the Survey Graphic, to let them know that things are not going along to even always. The scene that greeted Ford as he arrived at the River Road plant this January morning then probably gave him a considerable satisfaction. The extraordinary number of men huddled in the cold and freezing slush of the car park under the lowering clouds, elbowing and fighting one another, and the hiring agents to become one of those selected, shivering violently in the terrible blast from the fire hoses when they got too resistive. For him, the very number of such men could only have validated the power of the magic he had given the nation. Wow. Certainly, no individual and no industry so precisely illustrated the extraordinary convent between productivity and consumerism that had characterized the post-war years. Even before President Warren G. Harding died in August of 1923, leaving the nation in the hands of his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, the era of what would come to be called Coolidge prosperity already had begun its dizzy spin. Americans as a whole had emerged from the years of the war richer, healthier, and living more comfortable lives than ever before. Technological genius and business instinct combining to produce a material abundance quite unlike anything the world had ever known. Between 1915 and 1920, the gross national product had risen by more than 51 billion, about 414 billion in equivalent 1998 dollars, the largest 5-year increase in history. And while production declined sharply during the brief post-war recession, it began to climb again in 1925, until by the end of 1928 it stood at 97 billion. During the war years, disposable personal income had grown from a yearly average of 33.3 billion to more than 61 billion, and by the end of 1928 it had reached 77.5 billion. To the stress of the few preachers of frugality left in the land, a post-war boom in installment buying, $1 down and $1 a week at its most primitive level, let millions of Americans have immediately what they might have waited years for in pre-war decades: instant gratification in the matter of clothes and instant gratification in the matter of clothes and gadgets and even automobiles, bloated consumer credit from 2.6 billion in 1920 to 7.1 billion in 1929, the largest jump in the country's history. This plan of merchandising, the editors of the American Yearbook for 1928 announced with some satisfaction, is now recognized as the integral part of the economic life. In short, installment buying has settled down to a more or less normal existence. Such a development, its adherents insisted, was not just a mindless indulgence in materialism. It was indeed an integral part of the very democratic process in the nation's inexorable drift towards perfection. Nor was this dogma professed only by the kinds of dense and righteous go-getting businessmen who inhabited Sinclair Lewis's satirical 1922 novel, Babbitt. From social economist Simon Patten at the Wharton School of Economics in Philadelphia to sociologist Franklin Giddings at Columbia University in New York, there had developed a body of philosophical theory that maintained, as Patten put it in 1912, that the non-saver is now the higher type of man than the saver. Just as the saver was an elevation of type above the extravagance of more primitive man. People should spend, he said, and every instinct of society's industry, government, and culture should be devoted to encouraging a desire for goods, and then making it possible for more and more people to satisfy those sudden consumptive urges by providing them with easily available standardized products. They should be standardized, according to Giddings in 1922, because the conformity of goods was a necessary step towards the achievement of a conformity of values. Chief among the assimilative forces is standardized consumption. As consumers of wealth, we exhibit mental and moral solidarity. We want the same things. We have the same taste. So far as this part at least of our life is concerned, we have the basis and the fact of a highly general consciousness of kind. Henry Ford had played a central role in the flowering of this new age of assimilative consumerism. Ever since its first appearance in 1908, His Model T, with its modest price and equally modest aspect, became in the minds of many the most purely democratic machine in history. Ford himself had been fond of saying, "A Ford will take you anywhere except into a Ford will take you anywhere except into society." The Model T was sturdy, reliable, quirky, and through the years much loved. By 1927, when Ford finally ceased production of this heroic machine in order to go into production of the Model A's, the company had sold more than 15 million, many to the very working people who had built them. If someone had gathered all the vehicles together, then distributed them throughout the country in that one year, 1927, there would have been one Model T for every 8 people in the United States. And the vehicle's reputation suggested that almost every single one of the cars would still have been in working condition. Ford was hardly free of competitors. There were 44 other automobile makers in business by 1929. Although the big three of the Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were responsible for the manufacture and sale of more than 80% of the nearly 4.5 million cars built in the United States every year. Chrysler's Little Plymouth would give the Model A a run for its axle grease, and GM, which produced the Buick, the Oldsmobile, and the Cadillac, also had developed the Chevrolet, another powerful contender for Ford's basic market. Still, Ford was the colossus who bestrode the industry, indeed the nation. In 1924, there had even been talk of his running for president, an ambition he eventually disowned. Behind the man, however, lay a paradox to which he apparently was blind. This pioneer who had guided the nation into the rumble and stink of the automobile age held firm to the notion that almost everything in the rural past that his industry had done so much to change, even destroy, was better, cleaner, purer than the world he had helped to make. Since 1915, his film division had been grinding out a series of short inspirational movies celebrating the life, culture, and the morality of rural America, inventing scenes where they could not be found in reality, offering flickering image of sturdy farmers plowing with mules, of cheerful farm women churning butter at the hearthstone, of families gathering for meals and simple games played by lamplight, of hoedowns and square dances and church socials. He promoted country music, sponsored an annual fiddlers contest, and encouraged his executives to attend company-sponsored evening dance parties like those he remembered from his youth. He was an excellent dancer himself, moving about the floor with the bony grace of a praying mantis. He spent tens of thousands of dollars annually on the life-size puzzle pieces of Greenfield Village, a reconstruction near Dearborn, Michigan, that offered authentic old houses, including his own birthplace, shops, barns, buggies, and other paraphernalia plucked from everywhere in the country and brought to Michigan to make a rural dreamland. "I'm trying in a small way," he once explained to a curious New York Times reporter, "to help America take a step, even if it's just a little one, toward the saner and sweeter idea of life that prevailed in pre-war days." If Ford had ever discerned a contradiction between what he had created and what his heart yearned for, it has not been recorded, so he probably was equally oblivious to the significance of the 32,000 men gathered outside River Road Gate Number 3 on the morning of January 2nd, 1929, where he was a reflective man. This scene might have prompted him in question, in an answer that might have made him rest less easily in his certitude that all was well in the world and he had helped to conjure. If prosperity ruled the nation, as virtually every industrialist, banker, merchant, politician, financier, educator, and churchman in the land had been trumpeting for most of the decade. If this country was doing so well, why was it that 32,000 men needed work so badly that they had been willing to travel many thousands of miles by whatever means they could and suffer misery and, and risk of death in order to find it. That's what happened during the Obama years when they were trying to say they were trying to get people to go to North Dakota to go up there to get the oil or be derrick. What do they call it? Derricks or whatever, oil derricks, and it fell through because Obama passed all those regulations, and they ended up laying off a bunch of people down in South Dakota and North Dakota, basically where they were doing all the fracking. Everyone remembers that, huh? So now we have hardly any production now. It's all been reduced. Now we're getting all this oil from the Middle East. And I just heard one of the oil rigs that was coming through the Red Sea just got stopped. It got, I guess, what do you call, pirated or whatever, because we're stupid. Not only are we taking oil from the Middle East, but our oil derricks that are coming over here, oil rigs, are being hijacked. So now we have less oil. Thanks to the nice guy in the background right here, or back here, 46. Maybe I should change the background, huh? It's too depressing. This reminds me of Biden. Yeah, I'll use this one. That's the background of where I used to work. It's a hotel room. It's a gun house. It's one of the rooms. It's one of the old doors with the skeleton keys. Okay, here we go. On inauguration, I'm going to finish this anyway. On inauguration morning, March 4th, Herbert Hoover, the former Secretary of Commerce and now President-elect of the United States, put on his top hat and with his wife and family set off for the White House. There, he met with outgoing President Calvin Coolidge, exchanged pleasantries briefly, then joined him in the back of the inaugural limousine for the short journey down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building. The tall, white-haired, and somewhat portly president-elect was no stranger to the crowds that lined the route this morning. He had been a public figure for a long time and now had won national regard as a man of granite integrity and intellectual brilliance. He had earned his first reputation and his first $4 million, it was said, as an international mining engineer after graduating from Stanford University in 1895. Then, during the first 3 years of World War I, he had directed various international relief efforts for most of Belgium, the people of Belgium. When the United States entered the war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had chosen him to head up the U.S. Food Administration, and after the armistice, appointed him to direct the American Relief Administration. President Warren Harding had made him Secretary of Commerce in 1921, a position he had continued to hold until Coolidge, under winning, almost by acclamation, the nomination of the Republican Party in the summer of 1928. Hoover's Democratic opponent had been Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York, a colorful, experienced, and appealing candidate. Smith was not without significant financial support. His campaign manager was none other than retired General Motors executive John J. Raskob. But Smith did not have a prayer. He was, after all, Irish and Catholic, and had earned his political stripes as a happy warrior, as his admirer and political protege Franklin D. Roosevelt had dubbed him. For the Mavins of Tammany Hall, an institution universally despised as a sinkhole of corruption by reform-minded folks of all persuasions. Moreover, Smith had to face Hoover's extraordinary popularity amongst most Americans, particularly after the great humanitarian took charge of directing Red Cross relief efforts during the horrendous Mississippi flood of 1927, a task so handsomely publicized, though accomplished as things usually were with Hoover, with a cool, almost cold-hearted dedication to efficiency, that Hoover was fully justified when he told his friend, humorist Will Irwin, in May of 27, that I shall be the nominee, probably. It is almost inevitable. Smith also had to deal with the tide of optimism and prosperity with which Hoover was identified, a connection his opponent did not deny. Given a chance to go forward with the policy of the last 8 years, Hoover had said upon accepting the nomination, "We shall soon, we shall soon, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from the nation. I might," advertising man Bruce Barton remarked, "get more fun out of having Smith around, but I'd make more money with Hoover." That certainly had been the expectation of the 58% of the electorate who had voted for Hoover in November of 1928, giving him 444 electoral votes compared to a paltry 88 for Smith. Hey, Devil Dog, thanks for coming in. Hope it's not too boring. One would not have guessed at the enormity of his victory by looking at the man, except for evincing a brief twitch of warmth when they shook hands and the occasional almost reluctant smile at the crowds along the route. His death mask of a face was a match for that of Coolidge. In public, both men appeared to favor an institutional glumness, though each had a wry sense of humor when moved to express it. Their expressions were complemented by the weather. It was a typical late winter day in Washington, and a gray drizzle had been falling for hours. In spite of the rain, a good crowd was on hand in the Capitol Plaza to witness the quadrennial ritual of inauguration. On the platform, with the enormous Chief Justice and former President William Howard Taft presiding, the somber-faced Hoover put his hand on a new Bible, which had been opened to the Sermon on the Mount, and took the oath of office. Then, beneath an umbrella in increasingly heavy rain, he turned to face a rank of radio microphones to deliver his inaugural address. Remember, Biden didn't put his hand on the Bible, he put his hand on something else. It was like probably a spell book. It was not likely that anyone in the crowd or in the platform or in the radio audience was expecting fire and brimstone or much else in the way of oratorical excess. Hoover was admired as a man of great intelligence, but no one would have accused him of flamboyance in either action or speech. He surprised no one this morning, as his thematic Bible verses for the inaugural address. He had chosen Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. Hoover's own public vision was certainly happy enough. Ours is a land rich in resources, stimulating in its own glorious beauty, filled with millions of happy homes, blessed with comfort and opportunity. In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. In no nation is the government more worthy of respect. No country is more loved by its people. I have an abiding faith in their capacity, integrity, and high purpose. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope. Coolidge, sitting on the platform behind the new president, may not have been so sure of that. He had, after all, chosen not to run for a second full term and was, insiders said, glad to get out of town. As early as of April of 1928, the Kiplinger Washington letter had reported that, from a political angle, it is frequently said that the party which is in power between 1929 and 1933 will have more than its share of troubles and will have difficulty maintaining itself in the presidential elections of 1932. There are those who say that Mr. Coolidge recognizes this and therefore will not consent to serve another term. Nor did Hoover's own feelings necessarily match the finely tuned optimism of his official words. "My friends," he had complained gently in December, apparently forgetting that he had done nothing to discourage such hyperbole, especially during the 1927 flood, had made the American people think me a sort of a Superman, able to cope successfully with the most difficult and complicated problems. They expect the impossible of me, and should there arise in the land conditions which the political machinery is unable to cope, I will be the one to suffer. Less than 8 months after the inauguration, lyricist Jack Yellen bore witness to the validity of Hoover's worries and Coolidge's wisdom. It was October 24th, in the elegant dinner dance ballroom of the Hotel Pennsylvania in Manhattan, had only a smattering of patrons. As Yellen, a sprightly, compact elf of a man, handed several sheets of music and lyrics to lead singer George Olson to pass out among the other singers and the other band members. He was worried that this might not be just the right crowd for the premiere of a new song, especially this song. He and his partner, composer Milton Ager, had written the thing in Hollywood a few months earlier as part of the MGM musical called Chasing Rainbows, produced by Irving Thalberg, but not yet released. The movie, Yellen said later, was an incredible piece of cheese. There's like a weird noise outside. Thalberg, for his part, had hated most of the music the duo had composed and had demanded that they produce only a truly good song within 24 hours, or he would start a court fight that would keep them from publishing anything else he had written for the movie. MGM had given me a little office on the studio grounds, Yellen remembered, and I never left it to go to the set or meet with Ager. Milton spent most of his time playing golf. I finally got in touch with Ager and dragged him off the golf course and into my office to write a song. The whole thing took us under half an hour to write. With the movie still sitting on the shelf, the only hope for the song's success was to get it into circulation as soon as possible, and the best way to do that was to get it introduced here at the Hotel Pennsylvania, within a magnum's throw of Tin Pan Alley in the Broadway Theater District. Now in the sparsely occupied dining room, Yellow looked out worriedly on what he remembered as a handful of gloom-stricken diners, feasting on gall and wormwood. Olson laughed when he looked at the song's title, then passed out the sheets to the singers in the band. "Sing it for the corpses," he said. They did, and after a while, Yellen remembered, the corpses joined in, sardonically, hysterically, like doomed prisoners on their way to the firing squad. The song was "Happy Days Are Here Again." To Yellen's eventual delight, the song would become the anthem of the Democratic Party, an enduring musical symbol of the relentless optimism which the party became identified. That night, however, the patrons of the Hotel Pennsylvania had plenty of reason to think of it more as an iconic dirge, the proper accompaniment to the bitter end of an age that had flowered with near mythic splendor. As journalist Frederick Lewis Allen would recall, the period between early 1923 and late 1929 represented nearly 7 years of unparalleled plenty, nearly 7 years during which men and women believed at the end of the rainbow there was at least a pot of negotiable legal tender. For nearly 7 years, the prosperity bandwagon had rolled down Main Street. Well, thanks for coming in, Access Humboldt Unincorporated. The pot at the end of the rainbow had been a Democratic urn. Anyone could hope to find it, seize it, and use its contents to finance other pot hunting expeditions. So the litany of opportunity insisted, at any rate, at any one time or another during the decade, search parties bravely marched down every garden path of perceived opportunity. In California, for instance, the state already was earning its reputation as a bellwether for the nation, particularly in Southern California, where in the sprawling village of Los Angeles, the dream of possibility had taken on a manic depressive sheen. The people on the top in Los Angeles, the big men, radical writer and sometimes social worker Louis Ademick wrote in 1925, are the businessmen, the Babbitts, and trailing after the big boys is a mob of lesser fellows, all driven by the same motives of wealth, power, and personal glory. These were the types who had ballyhooed the glories of the California climate into a boom at the beginning of the decade, with tens of thousands of new residents, most of them middle-class Midwesterners, streamed west every year, traveling by train or by car along primitive highways into the broad visions of Los Angeles. They were drawn by a relentless siren song of advertising from organizations like the All Year Club of Southern California, which insisted that this paradise was just as benign in the summer as it is in winter. Sleep under a blanket every night all summer in Southern California. How funny. Waiting for the sun seekers Waiting for the sun seekers was an army of real estate agents, 43,000 strong, ready to sell lots as if they were lottery tickets. More than 1,400 new housing tracts sprang up, or were projected to spring up, approved by the Los Angeles Planning Department at the rate of 40 a week by the middle of 1924. The value of real estate permits jumped from 28 million in 1919 to more than 200 million by 1924, about 1.9 billion in modern dollars. And then the boom died. By the end of 1924, there were more lots than there were people willing to buy them. Banks, previously eager to make real estate loans, grew suddenly cool to new promotions and began calling in their money. Scores of subdivisions stood empty in the semi-arid plain and on the chaparral-covered hills of the Los Angeles basin. Their traffic-free streets and empty lots sprouting Russian thistle and gathering dust until whipped clean by the perennial Santa Ana winds. Never mind, there was always Never mind, there was always oil. Yes, it's oil, oil, oil. That makes LA boil. The members of the Uplifters Club of Los Angeles caroled in the club's roisterous official drinking song, and there was oil, a great deal of oil, more oil in one region of the country than had ever been found. Beneath the sands of Huntington Beach, for example, where in November of 1920, Standard Oil's Bolsa Chica #1 well began producing 20,000 barrels a day, or below the brushy slopes of Signal Hill over in Long Beach, where in June of 1921, a gusher sent a spout of black gold 114 feet into the air, or under the alluvial soil of Santa Fe Springs out near Whittier, where in October 1921, a Union Oil Company drilling team brought in the first well in what one geologist would describe as the greatest outpouring of mineral wealth the world has ever known. Where there was oil, however, there was also oil promoters. One of the most talented of them all was Canadian-born real estate I gotta say that again. One of the most talented of them was a Canadian-born real estate speculator named Courtney Chauncey Julian. In 1922, Julian bought 4 acres of Santa Fe Springs oil land and immediately started selling stock in the Julian Petroleum Company, Julian Pete, it would come to be called. With a blizzard of extraordinarily effective newspaper advertisements, Julian refuses to accept your money unless you can afford to lose, one bellowed piously. Widows and orphans, this is no investment for you. In just 6 days, the campaign had brought in more than $60,000. Julian bought more advertisements, which generated more money, which inspired more advertisements, which brought in more money. By the time his company had actually struck oil in measurable, if less than colossal, amounts, Julian was well on his way. By the end of the year, his promotion had sucked in $11 million from 40,000 subscribers. He leased more oil property, sold even more stocks, bought and constructed gasoline stations around the Los Angeles basin, and initiated a personal and spending and boozing spree, throwing spectacular parties, commandeering nightclubs, bribing his way out of drunk driving arrest, and in general heaping noisy contempt upon respectable Los Angeles society. He continued to produce oil, but mostly he produced stock certificates, which soon represented more in face value than any of his assets could possibly hope to satisfy. Before either the California state authorities, with whom he was engaged in almost constant squabbles over his methodology, or his own creation could bring him down, he cannily sold Julian Pete to oil speculator Sheridan C. Lewis in 1924 and went off to promote a bloated lead mining scheme in Death Valley. Lewis and his principal colleague, Jacob Berman, went to work swiftly. Julian Petroleum had been authorized to issue only 159,064 shares, each of preferred and common stock. This was an inconvenient number for expansive plans. Consequently, month after month, Berman manufactured carloads of stock certificates, and Lewis and his people peddled them frantically. Before they were done, Berman and Lewis had issued certificates representing about 3.7 million shares, at least 3 million of which were unauthorized. This was simple, unadorned counterfeiting, which did not seem to discourage scores of investors who simply pretended not to know about the ever-growing over-issue, forming huge investment pools, one of which reached a total value of 150 million. They demanded enormous returns on their money from the two promoters in exchange for their continued participation, taking their usurious profits, swiftly reinvesting much of these same profits in even more counterfeit stock. And on it went in a maddeningly complicated minute of unbridled greed that ultimately included the governors of the Los Angeles Stock Exchange, much of the local brokerage industry, entire accounting firms, city and state officials, Hollywood moguls like Louis B. Mayer, who at one point flew into a snit when he was shorted $39.50 in a stock transaction involving thousands. Underworld characters, political mavens, and many offices of many banks, not to mention tens of thousands of small investors who wanted a piece of the big petroleum pie. Onward and upward, and ultimately, as always, downward. In 1927, the gore of the inevitable crash splattered some of the most important political, financial, and social figures in California. The fraud was estimated at 150 million, and several of the principals, though not C.C. Julian, originator of the feeding frenzy, went to jail amid a stew of charges ranking from stock fraud to mail fraud, conspiracy to usury. One banker was assassinated, while one fringe participant was shot to death in a gunfight with another fringe participant. For audacity, avarice, complexity, color, and plain larceny, only the Florida real estate boom and bust of 1925 to 1926 compares to the Julian Pete fiasco. Even more money was involved in the Florida boom. One estimate had it at, in 1925 alone, 450 million in outside money had poured into Florida, while the value in building permits throughout the state had soared to an astronomical dimensions between 1924 and July of 1925, from 549,100 to 3.5 million in Miami Beach, 348,031 to $2.9 million in Tampa, and $48,000 to nearly $1.2 million in Hollywood, to name a few. Ballyhoo proliferated with none of its generated with more calculation than the spewing forth from the publicity machine of Addison Misner, who purchased 16,000 undeveloped waterfront acres in Boca Raton and declared his intention to build a 1,000-room hotel, polo fields, golf courses, a Venetian canal, lagoons, lakes, tennis courts, and the world's most beautiful boulevard. This was to accompany the growth of a great resort city on thousands of available lots whose future value could only be imagined. Banks in Florida and neighboring Georgia were only too happy to loan him the money to finance this dream, and there were plenty of high society types who were eager to get in on the ground floor of this wonderfully exclusive opportunity. Get the big snobs, Misner said, and the little snobs will follow. So they did. In Boca Raton and elsewhere, their eagerness fueled everywhere by tales of sudden and extraordinary luck. There was the story of the man who couldn't get $4,000 for his 80-acre tract in Sarasota in 1923. After he died, his inheritors sold it for $45,000, and a year later, it went for $240,000. Or the story of the Chicago woman who had inherited a chunk of land near St. Petersburg that had cost $400. At the height of the boom, she visited the state, took a look at her property, and sold it for $600,000. Explanation points lose their emphasis when relating incidents like that. The authors of Florida in the Making wrote thrillingly in 1925. Some of the stories of big money made in Florida real estate seem almost unbelievable, yet it seems likely that they will dwindle into insignificance besides the fortune still to be made. These were the kind of stories broadcast by the former Secretary of State and greatest orator of his age, William Jennings Bryan, who was paid $1,000 a year by the developer of the new town of Coral Gables to publicize Florida's glories and tell folks to come on down, take a look, and invest for themselves. Miami, Bryan declaimed in the middle of the boom, was the only city in the world where you can tell a lie at breakfast that will come true by evening. Bryan died in 1925, a few days after his brave creationist testimony at the famous Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee. So he was not around to see all the lies bring the boom down in 1926. Collapse was accompanied by a hurricane that killed an estimated 400 people, left at least 25,000 homeless, and an additional tens of thousands merely lotless, and created a landscape of physical ruin that provided an appropriate backdrop for the financial devastation many considered even worse. Bank transactions, which had swelled to more than $1 billion a year by the end of 1925, dropped to a pitiful 143.3 million by 1928, and all along the way, 150 banks in Florida and Georgia failed, taking with them more than $30 million in deposits. Whatever their individual logistics, whether in land, oil, or any other form of flimflammery, whether in Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, or elsewhere, speculative fevers were symptomatic of an economy so innocent of restraint and so prone to avarice that its acolytes either could not understand or chose to ignore the fact that fever in economics, as in humans, is not ordinarily a symptom of rampant good health. Thus was undertaken the definitive speculative adventure of the age, in which the bandwagon of prosperity, having survived California and Florida, continued to careen bravely through Main Street, America, only to veer recklessly into the New York Stock Exchange, where it was demolished in the most spectacular financial smash-up in modern history. It's a mouthful, huh? Wow, it's a lot. There's like how many more pages? There's like 10 more pages of this chapter of creating down Main Street. Yeah. Okay, I'll read a little bit more. I don't want to read too much because it'll get really boring. For John B. Watson, one of the I say county, I meant country. For John B. Watson, one of the country's leading behavioral psychologists and specialists in matters of the libido, the Wall Street fever of the 20s might have had something like a biological origin. In the relatively goatish atmosphere of the period, he maintained, sex has become so free and abundant that it no longer provides the thrill it once did. Gambling in Wall Street is about the only thrill we have left. While it is unlikely most investors actually believe that buying on margin and selling on the rise was better than sex, there is no denying the intensity with which they embraced this particular dalliance. The affair can be said to have begun in earnest in 1924, when stock prices took a sudden, sharp spurt upward, particularly after Coolidge's presidential victory in November. The comfort level that the business-minded Coolidge promised may not have been the only reason. The Federal Reserve Board had lowered its rediscount rate, the interest charged by the 12 individual banks in the Federal Reserve System to their member banks, in an effort to make money available for domestic industrial expansion and to encourage foreign investment in the United States. This, the theory went, would help stabilize the British pound, which the strains of World War I and its consequent debt load had left in a shaky condition. Stabilization of the pound might then strengthen attempts to reestablish gold as the linchpin of international commerce. The intricate dance of cooperation and communication among nations that a gold standard required had been all but obliterated during the war years, and the Western nations were making every effort to get back to the relatively serene trade relationships that had preceded the war. Still, the gold standard would not be fully reinstated in the United States, Great Britain, and Europe until the middle of the decade, and it would prove to not be the foundation for future stability, but one of the most prominent rocks upon which the economy of the age was wrecked. One unforeseen result of the Federal Reserve Board's action was to make more money available for investment in an increasingly attractive stock market. This was not what the Fed had in mind. Stock market boom worries officials here. The Kepler Washington letter, reported on November 22nd, but they can't do much about it. You ask what Washington thinks of the stock market. Well, this is a situation in which Washington opinion is not worth much. Washington did not think the market would go as long and as high as it has. Now it thinks surely the break is near. Break was not near. In May, the New York Times had reported the average price of 25 selected industrial stocks to be at $106 a share. By the end of the year, it was $134 a year, $134, and a year later, $181. During the same period, the volume of sales on the New York Stock Exchange rose from 54 million to 236 million. Sales evened out in 1926, but the year saw the Federal Reserve Board drop its rediscount rates once more, which pleased Treasury Secretary Andrew W. Mellon, who wanted easy credit for domestic expansion. This action, like that of 1924, was not sorely responsible for the outsized proportion of the subsequent boom. Previous stock market eruptions had taken place regardless of the price of money, and there was plenty of capital available even without borrowing. Between 1925 and 1929, the value of the nation's industrial output would rise from 60.8 billion to 67.7 billion, while savings and other time deposits would increase from 26.6 billion to 34.5 billion, the equivalent in modern dollars of more than 328 billion. But unquestionably, the Fed's reduction did not make it easier to borrow, and more capital was being sucked off by the lure of the market. In 1927, sales on the New York Exchange climbed to an unprecedented 577 million shares. There would soon be more. What came to be called the Great Bull Market by enthusiasts in a mass escape into a make-believe by economic historian John Kenneth Galbraith, began in March 1928, fueled by the combination of a 30-day jump in the New York Times industrial average of nearly 25 points and a parallel increase in the decibel level of stock promoters like Charles E. Mitchell. Sunshine Charlie Mitchell was president of the National City Bank of New York, but in heart and experience, he was less a banker than a high-octane financial pitchman who devoted the energy of his banks and its ever-growing number of branches to the selling of stocks and bonds in the national city and other corporations and investment operations. Look down there, he would tell the bank's team of 350 salesmen during pep talk lunches, rhetorically inviting them to get up from their cream corn and rubbery chicken and look out from the windows of the Bankers Club in Manhattan on the noontime crowd scurrying ant-like many floors below. There are 6 million people with incomes that aggregate thousands of millions of dollars, and they are waiting for someone to come and tell them what to do with their savings. Take a good look, eat a good lunch, and then go down and sell them. And so they did. They and thousands more like them in New York and anywhere in the nation where two or more were gathered in Possibility's name, aided in their promotions by an enormous public relations campaign directed by such consultant firms as the one-man operation called the McMahon Institute of Financial Research, or the equally ponderous Institute of Economic Research, whose lone operator, A. Newton Plummer, would later be accused by a congressional committee of having given more than $250,000 to financial writers on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the New York Herald Tribune in order to assure favorable comments on various stocks. Yes, thanks, Devil Dog, but it won't work because YouTube is, they got their ways. But thank you for the thought. And I'm going to read a tiny bit more, not too much. With promotional fuel fed to the fire regularly, the bull market continued on into June. Individual stocks like RCA and General Motors gaining as much as 15 points in any given day. Then on June 12th, the market suddenly appeared to break disastrously. Wall Street's bull market, the New York Times reported with unaccustomed liveliness the next morning, collapsed yesterday with the detonation heard round the world. It was a day of tumultuous excited market happenings characterized by an evident effort on the part of the general public to get out of stocks at what they could get. Individual losses were staggering, not staggering enough apparently to do anything but slow the market down momentarily. By the end of November, half the losses of June had been regained, and by the end of the year, the New York Times industrials had risen 86.5 points. The price of individual stocks bloated beyond all expectations. On March 3rd, 1928, RCA had been going for $77 a share, but on December 31st, it was over $400. So was Montgomery Ward, which had started at $133. Montgomery Ward's not even in business anymore. They went under. All through this dizzying year, the market had twitched in response to every economic stimulus. However vague, stock after stock rose, then fell, then rose again to new heights. Inspired by the same lambent greed that had made California's Julian Pete adventure so distended and fragile, brokers formed and massaged huge stock pools that, if not flawed by the production of counterfeit stock certificates, were no less inflated and profoundly risky. Nor were they any less tantalizing to many who could not bring themselves, as one observer put it, to resist the lure of action, of quick profit, the thrill of battle, the call of the chase, the glamour of admission into charmed circle, the attraction of a mysterious enterprise, and the social aura of association with the elect. Perhaps the biggest pool of all was formed by William Crapo, Crapo Durant, founder of General Motors, who was said to be manipulating as much as $1 billion in pool investments by the end of 1928. Pools were not the only games in town. Scores of equally rickety investment trusts and holding companies were created to speculate in nothing but stocks, and many of these, in turn, sold shares in themselves, building enormous paper pyramids whose only foundation was an abiding faith in permanent prosperity and the cleverness of their operators. Out in Chicago, utilities king Samuel Insull put together a complex structure of ownerships under the rubric of a trust called Insull Utilities Investments, and by the end of August had seen the trust stock rise from $12 to more than $150, helping to bring his personal assets to $150 million. My God, he explained to a colleague, $150 million. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy me an ocean liner. In January of 1929, even the relatively staid officers of J.P. Morgan and Company authorized the issuance of 4.5 million shares of common stock in a holding company called the Allegheny Corporation. The shares opened at $37 and soon shot up to $56, an especially happy increase for those few, like John J. Raskob, chairman of the Democratic National Committee and principal backer of Alfred E. Smith's presidential candidacy, who had been privileged to buy the stock at $20. Many thanks for your trouble and for kindly remembering me, Rasko wrote his benefactor, Allegheny Representative George Whitney, after being offered 2,000 shares at that price. My check for $40,000 is enclosed. I appreciate deeply the many courtesies shown me by you and your partners, and sincerely hope the future hold opportunities for me and the reciprocate. Alas, Smith lost the election in November, depriving Rasko of some truly magnificent courtesies he might have been able to provide as the president's good right arm. As 1928 turned, so did the market, upward at an increasingly vertiginous rate. Though there probably were less than 1 million actual participants, stocks had become the central issue of the day, even for those who had nothing directly at stake. You could talk about prohibition or Hemingway or air conditioning or music or horses, a visiting British journalist reported, but in the end you had to talk about the stock market. And that was when the conversation became serious. Most of the players were men, but there were estimates that by 1929, 29% of them were women. For a year, journalist Eunice Fuller Barnard wrote in the April issue of the North American Review. Indeed, all through the recent bull market, women by the hundreds have sat and even stood in the tense rows in the special stockbrokers' rooms set aside for them in various hotels at Upper Broadway in New York City. Day in and day out, through a long 5 hours, aggressive, guttural dowagers, gum-chewing blondes, shrinking spinsters who look as if they belonged at a missionary society meeting, watch pencil in hand, from the opening of the market till the belated ticker drones its last in the middle of the afternoon. What the heck? Whether male or female, in hotel rooms redolent of perfume and powder in midtown Manhattan, or in brokerage offices rank with cigar smoke on State Street in Chicago, Montgomery Street in San Francisco, Spring Street in Los Angeles, or similar enclaves of commerce around the country, thousands of players were able to participate only because they bought their chips on margin, paying anywhere from 10% to 20% of the face value of the stocks to a broker. The remainder of the stock's value stood as a loan from the broker, for which the borrower's certificate served as collateral. Brokers, in turn, got the money. Who got the money to finance such loans from the banking community, which found little to complain about in a system that allowed it to borrow money from the Federal Reserve's bank at 5% and loan it out at 12%, or from capital-rich industrial corporations like Standard Oil of New Jersey, which in 1929 devoted $97.8 million of its profits to such call money loans and earned $4.9 million in interest from the practice. More millions were poured into the brokerage market from abroad, especially from Great Britain, even though the drain of money seriously depleted the country's gold reserves, making it increasingly difficult to keep the gold standard raft from foundering. More than $6.4 billion in brokers' loans had been made by the end of 1928. By contrast, the income of the entire federal government for that year was $3.9 billion. This began to worry the Federal Reserve Board, which had already raised the rediscount rate, albeit somewhat timidly, in an effort to slow speculation. It had not helped. So far as the board is concerned, one financial writer explained early in 1929, it does not view the broker loans themselves as dangerous, but the diversion of funds to speculative channels which ought to be available for the normal needs of the country, especially in harvest seasons and in periods of necessary constructive activity, is regarded as a menace to the whole economic structure. The Fed's anxiety was echoed in Great Britain, where the Bank of England raised its own interest rates from 4.5% to 5.5% in an effort to stem the hemorrhaging of reserves. The Federal Reserve did not follow suit. Instead, on February 2nd, 1929, the board chose to scold the financial community. The Federal Reserve Act, the board insisted, does not contemplate the use of the resources of the Federal Reserve System for the creation or extension of speculative credit. When that abomination seemed to alarm the financial world, however, the board issued an assurance a few days later that it had no disposition to assume authority to interfere with the loan practices of member banks so long as they do not involve the Federal Reserve banks. Therefore, the board maintained a silence that many interpreted as ominous. Money suddenly became tight, and the market took a dramatic lurch downward at the end of March until Sunshine Charlie Mitchell announced that the National City Bank would continue to pump money into the call market no matter what the Fed might think, and backed up his words with $25 million in loans. The market quickly recovered. Between the end of May and the end of July, the New York Times industrial average rose 77 points. More than $5.8 billion in brokers' loans had been made just in July. By the year's end, the total would be more than $8.5 billion. The gains of some individual stocks nearly incomprehensible. National City stock leaped $500 a share in value in a single day in July. On another day that month, the total value of American Telephone and Telegraph (AT&T) stock increased by more than $75.8 million. On August 8th, the Federal Reserve finally did what speculators had been fearing for months. It raised its discount rate from 5% to 6%. The squeeze came too late to have much effort. Once again, the market stumbled briefly, then recovered. By the end of the month, more than $95.7 million shares had been exchanged, and the New York Times reported that the value of its 240 representative stocks had risen by more than $4.4 billion. Wall Street had become another world power. Lord Rothermere, proprietor of the London Daily Mail, wrote in July, with more authority than the League of Nations and more subtlety than Bolshevism. Perhaps not. But it was clear that the arcane world of Wall Street speculation was now the main arena in which the great game of prosperity was being played. However ambiguous the rules, however unthinking the hope, and there would be nothing subtle about its collapse. So, and it's like 4 more pages. Oh. So I'm going to cut this off right here. It's pretty long. Sorry about that. But I appreciate Devil Dog, you trying to help me out. I'm trying to understand this book. The timeline, I guess. The next chapter is The Boundaries of Havoc. It's like the next part of this book. And here's a quote from somebody. It says, in the Crucible, with the breakdown of our economic life, we had no sense of national destiny. It was not enough to know that we were always to be rich and lead the world in comfort. And the inadequacy was, of course, most apparent when it was proved that it had led us astray. We had for 20 years been throwing overboard the burden of libertarian ideas. We were not the country of free speech or free press or free assembly. We were not the country of the rights of labor. We were not free of religious prejudice. We were not interested in social justice. We heard of starvation wages and child labor and barbarous cruelty and chain gangs as if there were natural episodes in the brilliant newsreel of our lives. So long as they passed quickly, they did not matter. Gilbert Seldes from the Years of the Locust. It's like some book, I guess. I guess I should mark where I was. This is a huge book. So big it is. I can't even get it in there. But you can kind of guess how long it is. It's a long book. Yeah, this is the table of contents. Dang. It's like 20 pages is that. Holy crap. And he cites all his sources, of course, where he got all his information. Prelude, Careening Down Main Street, 1929. Ours is a story mad with the impossible. It is by chaos out of dream. It began as dream and has continued as dream down to the last headline you read in the newspaper. In our dreams, there are 2 things above all others to be said, that only madman could have dreamed them or would have dared to, and that we have shown a considerable faculty for making them come true. Bernard Devato to Catherine Drinker Bowen, 1940. Crazy. What is the title of the book? It's a good book. Let me get this background off. Remove this background. No background. You can see it. It's The Hungry Years, written by T.H. Watkins. I got it used. I ordered it as a used book. It's like recycled books. Because people don't want to read paper books, so sometimes I'll get new books or used books or whatever. Or sometimes I'll find books out of the library that they throw away. They're not throwing away, but they give them away for free. And some of them are pretty good books. They don't want them anymore. So, yeah, if you want to get your own title, it didn't cost that much to get your own copy. Plus, I bought some other stuff, Great Depression pictures and stuff. I framed them. So, some famous pictures, and they're really cool. See, there's all kinds of. It's all about the whole country that suffered from the Great Depression. So this is what this book's about. It's like the entire United States, how everybody suffered from the Depression and the grapes of wrath, that kind of stuff. Pretty cool, right? The drought and all that. So here's An Evil in the Season, right? It's called. It's just, yeah, it says The Evil in the Season is chapter 17. There's a lot of chapters. The great drought that had put people of the lower Mississippi River Valley dead up against it in 1930, sorely testing Herbert Hoover's faith and self-reliance and sending sharecroppers swarming into England, Arkansas, to demand food at gunpoint, had not ended. It had merely shifted. By the spring of 1931, it was the upper Midwest that began to suffer. And over the next 3 years, the misery spread south and west into every state between Front Range of the Rockies and the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. There was a brief respite for some states in 1932, but between June of 1933 and May of 1934, the Plains states experienced the lowest rainfalls on record, while from the Flathead Range in Montana to the San Juans in southern Colorado, winter snowfall in the Rockies ranged from 1/3 to 1/2 of normal. And in New Mexico, the Sangre de Cristos received little more than a dusting. With drought came heat. With drought came heat, more heat than millions had ever experienced, even in the plains, where the most ordinary summer could be a torment. Temperatures in the summer of 1934 were high enough to peel the varnish off the furniture, according to regional lore. In Veneta, Oklahoma, in the northeastern corner of the state, thermometers registered 117 degrees Fahrenheit on July 24th, the highest temperature in more than 20 years, and the 36th day in a row that it had been above 100 degrees. Omaha, Nebraska hit 107 that same day. Independence, Kansas 112 degrees. St. Louis, Missouri 110 degrees, the highest since 1871. In Grafton, North Dakota, 2 drugstore counter waitresses emulated folklore when they cooked a cheese sandwich by grilling it on the sidewalk outside the store. The urban death toll from heat stroke and related traumas rose to an estimated 700 people, 37 in Chicago alone. Rivers grew thin and brackish. Some creeks vanished entirely. Lakes, ponds, and reservoirs shrank, their receding waters painting dead white smears of sediment on their shores like rings in a bathtub. City water supplies became so loaded with concentrated salts and other chemical spices that many were left unpotable. Fort Smith, Arkansas, for example, was spending about $2,000 a day on bottled water by August. Water hasn't been drinkable for a month, a visiting reporter was told. Makes you sick to wash your teeth in it. Freshwater marshes were desiccated. Grasslands were so dry they rattled in the wind. Fish, frogs, toads, and salamanders died by the millions, while whole populations of resident and migratory bird species and other wild creatures plummeted. Paradoxically, in the northern plains, the heat and dryness hatched billions of grasshoppers, which emerged from their underground sites like a biblical scourge. Clouds of insects darkening the sky and eating everything from corn on the stalk to garments hung on clotheslines. Gasoline stations did a good business in grasshopper screens designed to keep the insects from clogging automobile radiators with their bodies. Locomotive wheels spun crazily on rails gone greasy with grasshopper carcasses. At one point, the air was so thick with grasshoppers in Moth, North Dakota, that the town had to turn on its streetlights and create bonfires on the corners. While over in Killdeer, while over in Killdeer, insects crackled and slithered 4 inches deep in the streets. Everywhere in the agricultural checkerboard of the heartland, crops not already eaten by grasshoppers shriveled under the withering blight of the sun, and livestock grew skeletal and frantic with thirst and hunger, in some places dropping dead in their tracks from the heat. Journalist Meridol Lesueur took an exploratory bus trip across Minnesota into North Dakota, trying not to look at the ribs of the horses and the cows, but you got so you couldn't see anything but ribs like bleached hulks on the prairie, the bones rising out of the skin. You began to see the thin farmer under his rags, and his wife as lean as his cows. Everyone on the bus, she remembered, talked about horses, cattle, seed, land, death, hunger. While the vehicle rattled through the paper dry landscape and people pointed out the windows at land now owned by insurance companies, and we saw it splitting open like rotting fruit after years of decay and erosion, exposing the gashed core. From eastern Wyoming, Lorena Hickok reported to Harry Hopkins on September 9, 1934, I saw a range that looked as though it had been gone over with a safety razor. In Utah, the water level in many irrigation ditches fell from 10 inches to an inch and a half. In summer ranges of the mountains, one cattle rancher claimed forage was as scarce as the stubble on an old man's chin. In oil-rich states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, a new drilling frenzy erupted, but this time derricks were built and tempered steel bits were sent corkscrewing hundreds of feet into the earth's crust to tap into dwindling aquifers, not pools of oil. There was an evil in this season, wrote James Agee in Fortune, the words accompanying a numbingly affected portfolio of drought photographs by Margaret Burke White. It was a time, he wrote, when much of the northern hemisphere was a little better than a turning hearth, glowing before the white continuous blast of the sun. Farm families looked to the sky every day, taking the measure of each distant towering cloud to see it might promise of hope. Until, for some, even hope became an anguish. The heat was like a hand on the face all day and night, Josephine wrote in her autobiographical novel of 1934. Now in November, when everything was finally dead, I thought that relief from hope would come, but hope's an obsession that never dies. Then there was the wind, as much a part of the geography of the plains as the buffalo grass through which it rippled. In a good season, the wind provided its own measure of beauty. Wallace Stegner remembered it as grassy, clean, exciting, with the smell of distance in it. In collaboration with the light, it makes lovely and changeful what might otherwise be characterless. In a drought, the wind becomes instead an enemy collaborating with sun and heat to annihilate loveliness and test the limits of human patience. A high wind is an awful thing, Meridol Lesueur wrote in describing what she experienced in 1934. It wears you down. It nags you day after day. It sounds like an invisible army. It fills you with terror as something invisible does. It was not just the wind itself that scraped at the nerves in this evil season, but the burden it carried, the direct consequence of generations of disregard for what the land could and could not be expected to do. It was a lesson that should have been learned long before. Of course, as far as back as 1864, when in Man and Nature, George Perkins Marsh had cited the nations of antiquity to demonstrate how entire empires could disintegrate once their land had been abused beyond redemption. In this country, Marsh's warnings had been validated during the ecologically ruinous 1880s. Out on the high plains, millions of cattle, half starved because the western range had been packed with animals and brutally overgrazed for years, perished during the winter of 1886 to 1887 in what was called the Big Die-Up. When the spring winds swept the land clean of snow, carcasses dotted a landscape that Theodore Roosevelt, anticipating Loretta Hickok, described as a mere barren waste. Not a green thing could be seen, the dead grass eaten off till the country looked as if it had been shaved by a razor. The lesson was driven home again when heavy rains repeatedly spilled off the timber stripped slopes of the Appalachians, lifted rivers out of their banks, and put the streets of Pittsburgh and other eastern cities under several feet of water that same decade. And in 1889, blew away a dam and destroyed the city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, killing 2,295 people. Some heed had been taken under Gifford Pinnock and other leaders of the progressive movement, including Theodore Roosevelt himself. 148 million acres of uncut forest in the West were placed under management of the U.S. Forest Service in the 5 years that followed the agency's creation in 1905, while in 1911 the government began a purchase program that would put several million acres of abused eastern forest under the same protective mantle. So I'm going to cut it off there. It's just another chapter 17. So it goes to 1930. That was 1934. So appreciate the view. Thanks for watching. And I'm on StreamYard, so that's why it's kind of different. So anyways, thank you whoever's still here. Appreciate being here. I'm just gonna write thanks for watching. I just decided to read at the end this book. Mostly history, medical books. Yeah, so thanks for whoever's still here. Appreciate it. Have a nice day. This took a lot of time to read this, but it's okay. I don't care. I like reading. It used to be my favorite subject. I like reading out loud. It's actually I like cooking too. So and reading out loud, both to me are tops. So, anyways, I thought I'd enjoy my day off and read a damn book on my channel. So, because I hadn't dusted this off in a while, so I'm trying to understand it. It's pretty complicated, but whatever. Everything's complicated. But it's part of our history and it's being erased, and I don't like that. You know what I mean? We should try to preserve everything we have. And thank you for coming and Access Humboldt Unincorporated. enjoy the California beautiful beaches, right? All right. Everybody, thanks for coming in. That was here. Appreciate it.